Hello everybody, it's Ben Fung with UpDoc and welcome to the 2021 edition of the Talent Acquisition Report. Now this is a report series that we've been doing for quite some time, just about as long as our popular Salary Norms Job Market Pulse series. In the past, what we focused on were really more objective qualifiers, the 6 dimensions of the compensation package, and some of the reasons why applicants would say yes or no or stay at a particular job. This year, we wanted to pair narrative analysis to really examine what the talent is looking for cognitively. What are really the deeper meanings of the deal makers, deal breakers, and the order qualifiers where they would even think about submitting an application for a particular job listing. We also dive into some of the tactical applications that employers can look to in terms of optimizing their job listings, as well as maybe some interview ideas for both sides of the equation so that we can create a little bit more of a collaborative environment in the job market rather than the traditionally competitive environment where the employer is trying to give less and the employee prospectively is trying to take more. Ultimately, it's a very much a we environment versus a us versus them environment that's going to really spell out success for our profession and our industry at large. And as we've discussed with our recent Corporate Quality Index report and the New Year edition of the Job Market Pulse, this cross-competitive element that is historically present in the industry is costing everybody way too much money, anywhere between 30 to 50% per annum equivalent as a cost of replacement for turnovers. And then it also costs the talent an incredible amount of opportunity when it comes to going from one job to the next. Speaking of which, we also dive into what are some of the collegial norms in terms of when I submit an application, when I can hear back for a first interview, maybe accept the final offer, and what that tenure to turnover looks like in terms of hiring gaps, both on the individual prospective candidate side, as well as if I'm a hiring manager on the employer side. There's also a really important discussion we need to expand on when the narrative analysis is taken a look at, and it really comes from the side of the working mother or the single parent. And their requests are very similar and requires us to think a little deeper in terms of how we structure employment and perhaps how we can strategize to create an empowering environment for individuals that might have different scheduling needs compared to the traditional full-time employee. So let's break it down. In no surprise, when you take a look at the tangible company offers that an employer organization may try to incentivize a candidate with, everyone seems to see the same value proposition in the same order. I will say yes to the money. I will say more or less yes to the benefits, and the perks kind of just come with the job. If you want to get a candidate to accept an offer, it's always about the cash payout equivalent or value of the salary. However, on the flip side, if you want to get someone to stay, it always breaks down to the company culture. And this is broken down into 3 primary veins. The first is the team culture, or maybe the workplace excellence culture. The second has to do with work-life balance, which has now seemed to cross-wave in terms of how applicants and how the workforce at large sees company culture, that these things are really blending across a continuum rather than as separate items. The final thing really has to do with growth tracks, and this is broken down between self or personal or professional development within the workplace and also the organizational opportunity of growing up into that company. In this report, we also talk about corporate excellence and how the job search is affected by the prospective candidate's perception of the employer organization. And this was mentioned in quite a bit of volume in the narrative input section of the survey. And it's important to remember from the Corporate Quality Index report late in 2020 that only 12% of the workforce can recommend their employer based solely on its ability to manage and appropriately performance up, coach up, or maybe terminate and let go of workforce members that are just a little bit below par. The tolerance to mediocrity is a massive area of redundancy and waste for most employers, and it becomes a system syndrome, not necessarily an intentional byproduct. That said, there's really interesting insights in terms of how the workforce ranks which elements of the primary pieces of corporate quality is most important to them. And some of the results are a little bit surprising. You'll have to dive into the report to take a look at those insights. And dun, 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 we're going to go there. We're going to talk about productivity and billing. We asked respondents 3 primary kind of open-ended questions in the survey, which comprises the first section of the report. And essentially it's what would make a deal for you, what would break a deal, and what would qualify a job listing or an employer for consideration to submit an application. And pretty much unanimously, in some respect or another, the biggest deal breaker mentioned by itself or in conjunction with other concepts had to do with billing, scheduling, double, triple, quadruple billing, and productivity standards that are considered by the workforce to be unreasonable. What was really interesting too is the way this was described, that booking is basically impressed upon the clinician, or the way things are told to be billed, or voluntold to be billed by the EMR or by the billing specialist or by the managers at large, were done in a way where the clinicians felt they didn't have autonomy over the way they practiced, over the way they scheduled, or even over the way they treated patients. Now, mind you, this isn't all employers by any means. This is the deal-breaking attributes of an employer organization. And almost every single sentiment on this led to kind of the singular thought and concern of, is this employer ethical in the way they practice their business? And is this employer maybe possibly a little bit fraudulent in the way they bill for their services? Now, even talking about this is a little bit cringy. It's cringy because it's just a cringy topic, but it's cringy that it even needs to be talked about. There's a certain level of call it a moral standard and compass that we should hold as clinical providers and as employers of clinical providers, where we all rely on these clinicians to be able to run companies and run payroll and make a living for ourselves, both individually and in concert. The fact that this is a point of discussion and a major point of concern, not to mention the #1 deal breaker, tells us that this is probably happening at a higher frequency of concern than is really welcomed to be discussed. And maybe that's where some of the solution needs to begin. We need to discuss this. We dive into some of the possibilities in the report, but in short, the average clinician on the front lines is not a compliance or billing expert, and the average compliance or billing expert probably hasn't been on the front lines of clinical care for some time. We need to just have this dialogue, and more importantly, it was noted that employers need to be open to having this dialogue in order to at least hold hands and go in the same direction without getting into a spat about things. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of friction when it comes to competing interests. But at the same time, in one company, it should be more collaborative interest than it is cross-competitive. That the friction internally inside the company really doesn't produce much value for anybody. And speaking of value, that's the other thing that was quite interesting in terms of the narrative input. And from what we can tell primarily from frontline treating clinicians, was their concern, again, only in deal breakers. We're not saying that every employer does this, but just as the deal breaker section, that the employers that are interested in high productivity standards don't seem to appreciate production value in terms of what that patient experience and care experience looks like to the patient consumer, as well as the treating clinical provider. Amongst the many other items and topics we talk about this report, one is worth mentioning in this intro video, and that is the topic of transparency. Now, we go into this in length and have talked about the case for transparency multiple times throughout all of our industry report series. We also talk about it in a soon-to-be-released corporate quality podcast by UpDoc Media. That said, the idea of transparency that the workforce is looking for isn't necessarily full-on, bared-out, books open type transparency. We're talking about the willingness to be open, as well as talking about some key decision-making points, as well as the inclusion of voices from the perspective of the workforce. Transparency isn't always clear as glass, and it isn't always what we conceive of it in our minds. Many times it's a mindset and an attitude to behold as you go into a dialogue, and an open dialogue in that fact. And it's that openness where transparency begins. We don't expect, no one I hope expects, that transparency is just, boom, everything's open, here are all my cards on the table. There's a level of trust on every side that needs to be established. And opening up that dialogue, having the willingness to talk about some difficult topics is where things begin. Two examples of perhaps a business process level transparency that the talent was very emphatic upon was first, clear expectations and guidelines and standards to pay. There was a bit of concern in terms of what does an actual base salary and bonus or productivity standard look like? What does CU dollars actually look like? There was actually quite a bit of complaints that their employer promised something and switched it out for something else. So two examples of, call it business process transparency, that the talent was a little bit concerned about was that on clear pay or clear numerical transactional relational aspects of the employment. Stuff like, what does the base pay look like? What does bonus structure look like? Can this be taken away from me? There's also a whole string of what does CU dollars actually look like? First, you might be promised something like this, but then all of a sudden you're promised and given. And unfortunately, this was pretty rampant. It was also very much in terms of the deal-breaking section that I can trust my prospective employer and that they won't do these switcheroos on me downstream. The second aspect in terms of business processes and the expectations of employment had to do with clear growth tracks. Now, we did mention that this doesn't always mean will I get promoted, but also what does mentorship look like? What does it look like for me to grow as a clinician? Do I have opportunity to expand and niche up or niche out so that I can do things that I really love with patient populations that I feel very much engaged with? So very often, expectation and clarity brings trust. And it's not, again, that all these employers out there are doing terribly. We have that well documented in the Corporate Quality Index. In fact, quite a bit of employers out there are doing very, very well. And they have retained their talent for 5, 10, 15 plus years. And this is fantastic. We're talking only and specifically about employer organizations that have a little bit of room of improvement. And here are some specific areas to either self-evaluate or to watch out for if you're on the job search. We also want to encourage employer organizations and those in hiring management positions to consider marketing for talent. This has been just a huge area over the last 5+ years, especially when we had the discussions at rehab business conferences, healthcare business conferences, and the private practice section conference. All of the owners and clinic managers that we talked to, really, they complain more about finding and retaining good talent more so than they talk about the pains of making sure that their schedule is filled for patient marketing. So there are some opportunities that we will discuss in this report in terms of how to market for talent. Last but not least, we need to discuss a certain group of respondents that identified as working mothers and single parents. And there are probably other descriptors that just either people weren't comfortable writing about or they tried to allude to it. But those were the two biggest groups which we can consider as part of a continuum of folks that may have time-pressed aspects of their household. And for these people, their request was that employers perhaps consider better PTO bank or accrual systems, or maybe more advantageous health benefits, or a more flexible schedule where they may only have to work 2 or 3 days a week, or our recommendation maybe is to consider treatment teams that breaks up the day into several larger blocks that warrant such employees to receive benefits. You can imagine, say, a treatment team 1 with clinicians A, B, and C, with A covering AM, B covering PM, and C being float to cover different holes that naturally will exist, whether it's in the clinic or in an inpatient circumstance or in a home health setting where you have to dispatch to multiple regions and geographies. And in that circumstance, this treatment team actually gives you more flexibility and coverage across your treatment supply chain as an employer organization, and can very well demonstrate better and more comprehensive value than, say, a single full-time employee clinician that only covers a 9-to-5 type block or maybe 410s. And that agility is so important when it comes to savvy business practices, not just for your operational supply chain, but also in terms of diversifying your workforce composition. There's a little bit more that we go into in the report, so we really recommend that you sign up for it, you download it, and you take a read and kind of see what would match well for you if you're sitting on the side of the employer, the hiring manager, or the clinic owner. And if you're watching this and you're reading the report and you're coming from the side of, hey, this is me, like I'm part of this continuum that have these unique emerging needs that maybe weren't there pre-pandemic or weren't even there 5 years ago in terms of the social welfare of the economy, well, then maybe here are some ideas that you might be able to collaboratively explore with your employer also. So that's all we have to discuss for this intro video. There's a lot more details to explore in the report, so be sure you sign up for it, download it, give it a read, let us know what you think. We really welcome your feedback. Again, I'm Ben Fung with UpDoc. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you at the next one.